I grew up in a small town in rural southern Mississippi, almost like a one-horse town. Everybody knew everybody. I did small things like sneaking out, underage drinking, and that environment is where I met Chad. When I first met him, the first thing that I noticed about him was his outgoing personality. For lack of a better word, he was very hyperactive, very go, 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 let's do. And he was also very attractive. I was very young and naive and lived in this fairy tale that I needed a man that would rescue me and take care of me. Chad gave me all those things. He made me feel safe. He made me feel secure. Our relationship moved so fast. I was barely 17 and he was 24. The day that I found out that I was pregnant with Scott was very scary for me. I knew, even as a teenager, that this was a lot and a huge step, and I was going to have to grow up really fast. The day that I told Chad that I was pregnant, he acted ecstatic. He was happy. Just a normal, I guess, soon-to-be dad. He started being more aggressive in his plans to find us a home to live in. I thought that that would give us time to just really become the family that I thought that we could be. We ended up renting a home from his older brother in the middle of nowhere, down a long dirt country road in the middle of the woods. For the first few weeks, we just lived together, trying to figure out what we were to each other. We would have bonfires and we would go fishing, and just the country way of living was really what it was. At that time, Chad was an attractive guy that was fun to be around. Early on in my pregnancy, there was a shift in the way Chad treated me. He started isolating me more. He slowly alienated me from family. Being an outdoorsy, tomboy, country girl, I had a lot of male friends. If I was allowed to be around them, he had to be in my presence, and it was very few and far between. And his jealousy towards those male friends fractured a lot of those friendships for a long time. Chad paved highways all across the southern part of Mississippi. He sometimes would be gone 5 days a week. I mainly would see him on the weekends. While he was gone, I was still isolated in the home that we lived in. He made sure of that because he would unplug the landline and take it with him to work. He would also take the only vehicle that we had and the cell phone with him. I was pregnant. I was terrified to be alone there in the middle of nowhere without a way to go or a way to communicate with anyone. One day he came home that weekend from working out of town, immediately jumps in the shower. You know, that was an immediate red flag for me. He's like, why, before he even touches me, does he have to get in the shower? And then I just decided to go through the cell phone, and I noticed there was incoming and outgoing calls to the same number that wasn't saved in his phone, and that he was talking to him for an hour or two at a time. So I ended up writing down that phone number and then calling from the house phone. And the lady informed me that they had been having an affair for about 6 months.
Did you think you could confront him about it?
I always had problems with self-esteem from a very early age. With Chad and with a lot of abusers, what they do is they break down your self-esteem, your self-confidence, and make you feel like there's no way that you could survive without them. I'm not sure when his interest in the military started. He had a almost unnatural obsession with firearms, and I think that probably played a big role in him originally joining the National Guard. Where I grew up in rural Mississippi, it is not uncommon for everyone to own firearms. But what was unusual with Chad's interest with firearms is that it went a little bit beyond that. He had up to 20 firearms, including assault rifles and handguns. He had an AR-15. He had an AK-47. He had a 12-gauge shotgun, 45 caliber handgun, 357 Magnum, and a 38 Special. That's the ones that I remember. And it was less about owning the firearms than the comments that he made regarding those firearms. The need to stockpile weapons in case, if there was ever an instance where he needs to be in a militia where to overthrow the government. When I was with him, I was 17 to 21 years old. It was very terrifying to me. There was an instance where we were driving down a back road in the middle of the woods. I remember it being a really hot day. In my area, there's a lot of strays and stuff that get dumped in the country. And a dog was just walking down the side of the road, and Chad stopped all of a sudden, and he called the dog to the driver door. And the dog was happy to see him, wagging his tail. And he grabbed his 45 caliber handgun out from underneath the seat. And he was saying, "Come here, Poochie, come here." And the dog kind of put its front paws on the side of our vehicle. And at that point, he just shot the dog in the head. To see someone be so evil towards animals was something I had never witnessed before in my life, and it traumatized me, it scared me, and I think it was to let me know that he's capable of doing some pretty horrible things if I didn't get in line. Chad was extremely peculiar about the way the house was supposed to be. He made it obviously clear that what my station in life was to be a housewife, a mother, and a maid. It was a compulsive, it was obsessive. He would want things lined up a certain way. All of the vegetables in the cabinets, they all had to be grouped together. The corn together, green beans together, all the labels facing a certain way. It all had to be lined in a uniform, straight manner. Usually when I knew that he was heading in for the weekend, I would spend that whole day before scrubbing with Q-tips, toothbrushes, just getting everything right. But in those occasions when something slacked, I paid for it. Dirt on the floor could cause him to empty out and dump out dressers and tear clothes out of closets and flip mattresses off of beds, swipe clean dishes off surfaces. There was instances where his nose would almost touch my nose. To look into his face, it looked sometimes like he was looking straight through me. Like he wasn't even looking at me, he was looking straight through to something else, and his eyes almost became black. And as time went on, the violent aspect of our relationship really got more intense. The first time that Chad ever laid hands on me was about 6 weeks after I found out that I was pregnant. I went into the bedroom, into a dresser, and he was sleeping because he was working the night shift. And the drawer squeaked, and it woke him up. And he immediately jumped up out of bed, grabbed me by my hair, dragged me out of the room, kind of tossed me into the hallway and slammed the door on my face. I was shocked. I didn't know what had just happened. I was confused. I was scared. My heart was racing. I didn't know what to do. And I just stood there dumbfounded. And then after a few minutes, he came out and he wrapped his arms around me from behind and just said that he was sorry, that he had never done anything like that before to someone, and that he was probably half asleep when he done it, and that it would never happen again. At the time, I believed him. You know, I woke him up. He's tired. He works. He provides for me. And I was so inconsiderate to go in there and wake him up. I didn't want to leave because there were times where things were really, when they were good, they were okay. And it kind of helped soften when things weren't okay. It didn't last long compared to the good times that we had. Scott was born on January 9th, 1998. I was 18 years old, and I instantly fell in love with him. From the moment he took his first breath, he was a ball of energy. Things were really good for a little while after that. There are times where we got along great, and we laughed and we loved, and he would shower me with compliments and gifts and love. So for a little while after Scott was born, he kind of helped us have better times and make good memories of him when he was a newborn. It was calm, and there were no violent instances where he hurt me. We got married when I was 6 months pregnant with my second child at the time, Cynthia. There was no proposal, there was nothing romantic that happened. It's just, hey, we're getting married. We walked in front of a judge, and it took about 10 minutes, and I wore blue jeans and a t-shirt, and that was it. It was done in 15 minutes. After what I would call a honeymoon break, we would just eventually circle back around. By the time I was pregnant with Cynthia, I kind of knew the routine. He would be angry, he would become violent, he would become remorseful, and you could see a pattern forming. I lost all my friends, and my family were disappointed in me and did not like him. It made it really hard to have a relationship with them. been long since I had Cynthia. She was probably a few months old. One day, he had been working out of town and he had came in and I had made spaghetti about 3 days before. And he made the comment, "Why is this still in here?" He grabbed me by my hair and made me get on my knees in the middle of the kitchen. And he set the pot of spaghetti in front of me. And he started scooping handfuls of spaghetti out and force feeding me. He's like, "Eat it. If you expect me to eat it, then you should have no problem eating it." And he started rubbing it on my face and in my hair. He would take his hand and like push my face back like that. He started punching me and slapping me around. He drug me into our bedroom where he continued to assault me and continued to beat me for a considerable amount of time. After he'd done that, he made me scrub the floors on my hands and knees with bleach rags to clean up the spaghetti sauce. There was something about that day, him treating me like I was not human. By the next morning, I had 2 black eyes and a fractured rib on my right side. He had never touched the kids in an aggressive manner, but it terrified me, and it terrified me, like, how far is this gonna escalate? I never realized that he, even as evil and as vile as he is, that he would go that far. When Chad left for work, I got my children dressed and myself dressed, and I walked to the nearest neighbor where I could use their phone. I called my family, and they said that I would need to press charges on him. He beat me pretty bad, so I pressed charges on him. He was arrested and booked, and once he went to court, the judge had an agreement with his lawyer that he would seek psychiatric help in a inpatient facility and start medication. After he was released from the psychiatric facility, I was very much on guard. But over time, I felt like I saw a difference in him and that the therapy and medication was working. I didn't know not to believe him. It all goes down to him spinning it around to make it somehow seem my fault. A few months later, I became pregnant with Joe, my last child. At that point, I had 3 children by him in 3 years. And I realized that how was I ever going to escape this relationship if I kept having children by this man? And unbeknownst to him, it was absolutely a big risk, and I was terrified the whole time. I went behind his back and had my tubes tied while he was out of town 1 week. Chad was working out of town. While I was waiting for him to come home, I had went to see my dad that day, and I was a little late getting home, and he was frustrated that I was late, and he started in on me. Scott at the time was 3, and Scott ran into the living room as he was beating me and tried to separate us and tried to get in between us. And at that time, Chad picked him up, threw him onto the couch, and slapped him across the back so hard that it left a handprint. He always kept a handgun in the nightstand, and it always stayed loaded. And he laid me across the bed, and he straddled me with his knees on each side of my shoulders. And he told me to open up my mouth. And he forced the gun into my mouth. And he got really close to me, his mouth to my ear. And he said, "Do you see the evil in my eyes?" I thought I was dead. And I vomited on me and him and the gun. And at that point, he pulled me off of the bed, put me on my knees, and at this point, he put it to the back of my head. It was like a switch. He went from this aggressive, crazy, evil mindset to talking normally on the phone, setting up arrangements. And he said, "Get in the vehicle. We're going, get the kids up, get a towel for your face. And if you let anyone see your face, I will kill you when we get home. I will promise you that I will kill you." I had always made a promise to myself. I said, he can hurt me as much as he wants, but the first time he ever puts a hand on my children, I will be gone. And so I got the kids into the van. He drove to the house, and I just prayed the whole way there. I just said, "God, make a way for me to escape right now. I'll never look back. I swear to you." And he stepped out of the vehicle and was walking up to their door. And I jumped into the driver's seat and I locked the door. And I probably did about 60 miles an hour in reverse out of their driveway. And when I went to put it in drive to go forward, he had run across their small yard and jumped in front of the vehicle. And he was mouthing, "I'm gonna kill you." And I just closed my eyes and I pressed the gas. He could do whatever he wanted to me, and I would put up with it. I always said he'll never hurt my kids. But I always had this knot in my stomach that something was going to happen. Never see him again. Sorry. If he said that he was going to take my children from me and I was never going to see them again, I believe that he would make that happen. Even though I wanted to break that bond with them because it was so tight. I think in this picture that Scott's emotions in it are genuine. I think that Chad's is for the camera. This is Scott. He loved to dress up in his dad's Army gear. It's one of my favorite pictures. After our divorce, I decided that I was going to stop depending on men for my livelihood, and that I was going to step up and take care of myself. I can't think of anything more empowering for a woman than to join the United States Army, and that's what I did. I just had recently graduated basic training with the United States Army. I actually met Eric through one of his friends.
January 1st of 2007, a friend of mine had gone to a New Year's Eve party. I was on duty that night. The following afternoon, he called me and said, "Hey, I met a girl. Will you come with me? She has a friend." Well, we kind of hit it off, and we liked each other a lot. It got serious pretty quickly.
When the kids first met Eric, Scott was 10, Cynthia was 9, and Joe was 8.
We went to the beach when I played catch on the beach, and their dad had never done that with them. The kids throughout the years have gone back and forth from dad to us. The teenage years in particular were a little bit difficult. Their love for their father and what he was constantly telling them was kind of against all the rules and expectations that we were trying to set in our house. We had his father telling Scott that he didn't have to listen to me. And that caused a kind of a rift. So Scott, he was very outgoing, and he lived the kind of life where he didn't care who was looking. He was the guy that everybody invited to the party because he was gonna bring it. I met Chet on a few occasions. Jessica always asked me to maintain a cordial relationship with him for the kids. And so I tried to do that. I will tell you that there's not a single time that I have been around Chad Graves that I have not had a gun on me, though, because I do not trust that man.
We actually met in the 7th or 6th grade, but when we got to high school, we kind of went our separate ways until he contacted me on Facebook. He's very, very charming. He would open the car door for me, help me put my seatbelt on, just very, very gentlemanlike. I was aware Chad was on medication. A month or so, I guess, 3 months maybe after we got together, he told me that he had had some issues with PTSD from being in the Army, because as far as me and him, he had not shown any violent side yet. Chad would tell me and Scott about some of the things he'd done in the military. He told us that he was a commander on a Bradley, and they hit an IED and it flipped the Bradley, and he landed on his head, and that's how he got injured in Iraq. I believe Scott was 16 years old when I met him. Scott was very, very loyal to his daddy. It didn't matter what Chad done to him, he would always forgive him and hug him and tell his daddy that he loved him. No matter what Chad did, he always forgave him.
I woke up like it was any other day. I got up, made me some coffee, and I noticed that I had a missed message on Facebook from someone that I did not recognize. It stated, "Hello, I'm a friend of Chad and Stacy's, and Stacy's trying to reach you. It's an emergency. Please call her back at this number." And so immediately my first thought was, they've probably got into an argument and they fought. So I called, and as soon as Stacy answered the phone, I couldn't understand her. She was screaming and crying and saying over and over that he killed him.
On August the 16th of 2018, Scott asked his dad if he could go to his grandmother's house, and Chad told him no. And things escalated from there. Chad was in the bed. I was standing beside the bed talking to Chad. And the next thing I know, Chad jumped up out of bed, pushed Scott into a corner. That's where Chad's shotgun was. Scott grabbed the nozzle of the gun, and then Chad grabbed it, and that's when they started fighting over it. They worked their way into the dining room, fighting over it, wrestling over it. From where I was standing, I couldn't see where Scott was, but Chad I could see. And he had the shotgun in his hand. And I said, put the gun down, what are you doing? And he just looked at me with a blank look. And he racked the shotgun and then fired. I'm sorry. I come running out of the bedroom to get to Scott, and Chad got in front of me and told me, don't look at him, don't touch him, call 911. I was in such shock. And then after that, it's all a blank until the police get there. The police took me out in the breezeway of the apartment. I'm in my pajamas, no shoes. Chad was to the left of me, and I remember them arresting and handcuffing him. But they took me to a police car. It's pouring rain this night. From there, he goes to the VA, to the mental hospital.
I was at work. It was about 9 o'clock in the morning. I was on a break, and Jessica called me, hysterical. And she's screaming into the phone, he killed him, he killed him, he killed my baby.
And I prayed for God to send him back to me and that he could take me. And then the next thing I remember was being in the front yard on my knees and a police officer from our town pulling up to be with me until Eric could make it. And I fell onto hot asphalt and laid in the fetal position. Well, my whole world just fell apart. I immediately knew there was no way that it was self-defense, because I know my son and I know what kind of heart he had, and I know how evil Chad was, and I knew that he would say whatever he needed to try to get out of trouble. I let fear drive me to accept the custody agreement. And I will, to this day, for the rest of my life, feel guilt and anguish over that decision.
They looked at all the evidence. All the shotgun pellets were in the baseboards of the floor. The way the blood was pooled showed that Scott was on the floor when he was shot. So he was not a threat for Chad. He could have put the gun down at any time. Chad shot Scott like it wasn't nothing to him. And I can't comprehend it. The police arrested him on August the 29th of 2018 at the Biloxi VA when he was being discharged.
With Chad being manipulative, he found this perfect opportunity to say, hey, I have PTSD. But anybody that knew Chad before he deployed knew that this behavior didn't come around because of PTSD. Because he was abusing people and being violent way before he ever saw combat. In which we later found out he, in fact, never saw combat. People don't realize that not every job that you do in the military puts you in harm's way or puts you in a combat situation. I contacted several of his Army buddies And they told me, early on in his deployment, he was deemed a liability because of a negligent discharge. They pulled him off of the front lines and put him behind a computer.
He lied about everything that he did in the military. I would have felt betrayed. I believe he uses PTSD as a crutch. I mean, you don't lie about stuff like that.
When I saw him walk in, I was shocked at his appearance, his age, rightfully so, being in jail for the last 3 years. I saw very little remorse. They told me I could have a few moments to speak, and I took 6 minutes to give my victim's impact statement.
First part of this grief journey is to watch my other children grow up and have to deal with the loss of their brother.
I looked him in the face, and there was no expression, except for the fact when I said, Scott was the only child that loved you unconditionally and forgave you for everything you ever did to him. And at that point, he shook his head yes. And then they asked him if he wanted to speak, and he said no. And then they sentenced him. The fact that he could get out in 6 years consumed me. I kept thinking, what do I need to do proactively as a parent to protect my remaining children? How do I protect us all?
He was just a mean, evil person who could do that to their own child and not show any remorse.
I, in the back of my head, always believed that one day Chad would go too far. But I never thought that it would be one of his kids. And furthermore, I never thought that it would be Scott. The one kid that always stood by him, always defended him. Chad didn't become a monster because of Iraq. Chad was a monster from his teenage years to the point where he decided to pull the trigger on his own son.
For a long time, I felt like a piece of me died. I got justice for it, to some degree. I was honored to be his mother. The world is really missing out with him not being here anymore.
The fluorescent lights above the Fullerton Transportation Center never truly slept. Even after the evening commuters had disappeared into the quiet neighborhoods of Orange County, the station continued to breathe in slow, mechanical rhythms. A distant train rolled across the tracks. Traffic hummed somewhere beyond the parking lot. A warm California breeze carried scraps of paper along the concrete, lifting them for a moment before dropping them back into the darkness. It looked like an ordinary summer night, the kind that fades from memory before the next sunrise. But some nights refuse to disappear. Some nights become evidence. Some nights are replayed thousands of times, examined frame by frame, sentence by sentence, until every second becomes part of a national argument that refuses to end. This is the story of one of those nights. It is a story about a man who had already lost almost everything long before his life came to an end. It is a story about police officers sworn to protect the public, whose actions would later be defended by some, condemned by others, and dissected in courtrooms, newsrooms, and living rooms across America. It is a story that raises difficult questions without offering easy answers. Where does force become excessive? How should officers respond to someone whose greatest threat may be his own illness? What happens when the official version of events collides with a camera recording something the public cannot forget? On July 5, 2011, those questions arrived in Fullerton, California. They have never completely left. At first glance, Fullerton seemed like the kind of city where tragedy belonged somewhere else. Located in northern Orange County, it was known for its universities, quiet residential streets, busy shopping districts, and neighborhoods where families gathered for weekend barbecues. Students hurried between classes. Parents walked children to school. Commuters caught trains heading toward Los Angeles. Visitors stopped for coffee before continuing their journeys. Life moved according to familiar routines. The transportation center stood at the heart of those routines. Every day, buses arrived and departed with predictable precision. Trains carried office workers before sunrise and brought them home after sunset. Travelers crossed paths without learning each other's names. Security cameras watched silently from above, recording every arrival, every departure, every forgotten backpack, every hurried embrace between loved ones saying goodbye. Few people ever imagined those cameras would one day capture images that would be shown across the country. The station had another community as well. When the commuters went home, others remained behind. Homeless men and women often gathered around the transportation center because it offered light, shelter from the weather, public restrooms, and the possibility of food or spare change. Some had fallen on hard times after losing jobs. Others struggled with addiction. Many carried invisible wounds that could not be seen by passing strangers. To most travelers, they blended into the background. To each other, they were neighbors trying to survive another night. Among them was a man many locals recognized by sight. His name was Kelly Thomas. By the summer of 2011, Kelly had become a familiar figure around Fullerton. Shop owners occasionally saw him wandering through downtown. Bus drivers recognized him. Volunteers who worked with the homeless knew his face. Some residents greeted him by name. Many described him as gentle. Others remembered conversations that drifted in unusual directions because Kelly lived with schizophrenia, a severe mental illness that changed the way he experienced reality. His thoughts sometimes became tangled. His speech could become disorganized. He occasionally talked to people who were not there or reacted to fears that existed only inside his mind. Yet those who knew him often spoke of something else. His smile. His politeness. His childlike curiosity. Mental illness had taken much from Kelly, but it had not erased his humanity. Long before he became known as a homeless man sleeping near train stations, Kelly had been someone's son. Someone's child. Someone whose future once seemed open with possibility. Like countless families confronting severe mental illness, the Thomas family faced battles that outsiders rarely understood. Treatment required consistency. Medication required trust. Recovery demanded stability. But schizophrenia often convinces those suffering from it that they do not need help at all. It can become an invisible prison. Some days Kelly accepted treatment. Other days he refused. His father searched for ways to help him, hoping each attempt would succeed where the last had failed. Friends and relatives watched with helpless frustration as the illness slowly dismantled the ordinary life Kelly might have lived. The disease stole opportunities. It stole relationships. Eventually, it stole his home. By 2011, Kelly was living on the streets. To some people, he became little more than another homeless man carrying a backpack. To others, he remained Kelly. A familiar face trying to survive another day. His life had become unpredictable, but there was one thing that remained remarkably consistent. Most people who regularly encountered him did not describe him as violent. Confused, yes. Disoriented, often. Struggling with mental illness, unquestionably. dangerous was not the word many chose. That distinction would later become one of the most fiercely debated aspects of everything that followed. Because on one warm July evening, perceptions would collide. One person's concern would become another person's emergency. A routine police response would transform into a national controversy. And a conversation lasting only a few moments would change countless lives forever. The call that reached the Fullerton Police Department that evening appeared ordinary. Someone reported suspicious behavior involving vehicles near the transportation center. For police officers, such calls were common. Officers were expected to investigate potential crimes before they escalated. Property crimes often began with seemingly minor reports. Ignoring suspicious activity could mean allowing theft or vandalism to continue unchecked. From that perspective, responding made sense. No one answering that call could have predicted the consequences waiting at the station. Or perhaps they simply believed they understood what they were about to encounter. The distinction would become critically important later. Because expectations shape decisions. Decisions shape actions. And actions shape history. As darkness settled over Fullerton, officers drove toward the transportation center. Somewhere nearby, trains continued arriving according to schedule. Passengers stepped onto platforms carrying briefcases, backpacks, shopping bags, and suitcases. Most never noticed the homeless man sitting nearby. Most never imagined that within days, his name would appear on television screens across the country. History often begins quietly. There is no music announcing its arrival. No warning that ordinary moments are about to become extraordinary. Only small decisions. Small conversations. Small misunderstandings that grow larger with every passing minute. In the years that followed, investigators would examine surveillance footage repeatedly. Experts would analyze medical reports. Lawyers would argue over police tactics. Witnesses would remember details differently. Television commentators would debate accountability. Protesters would march through Fullerton demanding justice. Jurors would spend weeks weighing evidence. Families would carry grief that no courtroom could erase. Even today, more than a decade later, people continue to ask the same difficult questions. Could this have ended differently? Was the force used that night reasonable under the circumstances? Did mental illness fundamentally change what officers should have done? Or did a series of escalating decisions push everyone toward a tragedy that might have been avoided? Those questions remain deeply contested. What is not disputed is the ending. Kelly Thomas suffered catastrophic injuries during his encounter with multiple police officers on the night of July 5, 2011. He was transported to the hospital in critical condition and died 5 days later. His death ignited nationwide outrage, prompted criminal charges against several officers, led to highly publicized trials, and became a lasting symbol in debates over policing, accountability, and the treatment of people experiencing mental illness. But before there were courtrooms, before there were protests, before television crews crowded the sidewalks outside the police station, there was only a warm California night. A quiet transportation center. A man carrying everything he owned inside a worn backpack. And a series of moments that seemed ordinary until they could never be taken back. This is where the story begins. In the silence before the shouting. In the calm before the struggle. In the fragile space between an everyday police contact and a tragedy that would leave an entire community searching for answers that, even now, remain painfully incomplete, the sun rose gently over Orange County, painting the rooftops of Fullerton in warm shades of gold. Morning commuters filled the streets with familiar routines. Coffee shops unlocked their doors before dawn. Parents hurried sleepy children into waiting cars. Students crossed intersections with headphones on, barely noticing the city waking around them. To most people, Fullerton represented comfort. It was a place where neighborhoods were lined with carefully trimmed lawns, where parks echoed with children's laughter, and where the downtown district mixed historic brick buildings with restaurants, bookstores, and cafes. California State University, Fullerton, brought thousands of students into the city every year, creating an atmosphere that felt energetic without being overwhelming. The Metrolink station connected residents to Los Angeles and neighboring communities, making Fullerton a city constantly in motion. It was not the kind of place most Americans imagined when they thought about violent confrontations between police and civilians. That assumption would eventually make the events of July 2011 even more shocking. Because tragedy often hides behind places that appear ordinary. The Fullerton Transportation Center stood at the crossroads of those ordinary lives. Every weekday morning, trains arrived almost like clockwork. Business professionals carrying laptops stepped onto platforms without looking up from their phones. College students rushed toward classrooms with backpacks slung over one shoulder. Tourists unfolded maps, trying to find the right bus route. Taxi drivers waited patiently outside the station, hoping for another fare before lunchtime. Everything seemed temporary. People came. People left. Few stayed long enough to notice the quieter world that emerged after sunset. As daylight faded each evening, the transportation center transformed. The rush of commuters gave way to long stretches of silence broken only by the distant rumble of passing trains. Security lights cast pale circles across the concrete. Empty benches waited for the next morning's passengers. Wind carried discarded newspapers across the parking lot. For many homeless residents of Fullerton, this became one of the safest places to spend the night. The station offered light, public restrooms, water fountains, a roof that provided limited shelter from rain. More importantly, it offered visibility. Sleeping in complete darkness carried its own dangers. Theft, assault, and harassment were constant concerns for people living on the streets. A well-lit transportation center, watched by security cameras and visited periodically by police officers, could feel safer than an isolated alley. The homeless community developed its own routines. Some people quietly collected recyclable bottles during the day. Others visited churches or charities offering meals. Some searched for temporary work. Many simply tried to survive another 24 hours. Among them walked Kelly Thomas. People remembered him differently. Some recalled seeing him talking quietly to himself while sitting on a bench. Others remembered polite conversations that wandered into confusing directions without warning. Store employees occasionally offered him water. Restaurant workers sometimes handed him leftover food at closing time. Volunteers from local outreach organizations recognized him immediately. His appearance reflected years of homelessness. His clothes were often worn. His belongings fit inside a backpack. His hair and beard grew unevenly. Yet beneath the hardships was a man whose life had not always looked this way. Kelly had grown up in California surrounded by family. Those who knew him before schizophrenia described someone completely different from the man later seen wandering downtown Fullerton. He laughed easily. He enjoyed ordinary conversations. He had dreams that resembled those of countless young adults. No parent imagines watching mental illness slowly dismantle the future they once pictured for their child. Kelly's father, Ron Thomas, understood that heartbreak better than almost anyone. As a former Orange County Sheriff's deputy, Ron had spent years in law enforcement. He believed in responsibility. He believed in protecting communities. He understood police work from the inside. But nothing in his career prepared him for becoming the father of a son living with severe schizophrenia. Mental illness rarely destroys a life overnight. Instead, it chips away piece by piece. At first, the changes can appear almost insignificant. Sleep patterns shift. Conversations become unusual. Concentration disappears. Friends drift away without understanding why. Then reality itself begins to change. Schizophrenia affects the brain in ways that outsiders often struggle to comprehend. Voices may seem completely real. Delusions become impossible to separate from truth. Fear grows from places invisible to everyone else. Even accepting treatment becomes extraordinarily difficult because the illness frequently convinces sufferers that nothing is wrong. Kelly's family repeatedly tried to help him. There were attempts at treatment. Periods of medication. Moments when life briefly seemed capable of returning to normal. But consistency proved elusive. Like many individuals living with schizophrenia, Kelly sometimes stopped taking his medication. Without treatment, his symptoms intensified. Stability slipped away again. Each setback widened the distance between the life he once had and the reality he now faced. Eventually, homelessness became part of that reality. Living on the streets placed Kelly in a world where survival depended on instincts few housed residents ever needed to develop. Every possession mattered. Every meal was uncertain. Every encounter with strangers carried unpredictable risks. Even so, many people around downtown Fullerton came to know him not as a criminal, but simply as Kelly. That distinction would later become deeply significant. Because after his death, investigators searched extensively for evidence that Kelly posed an extraordinary danger before the confrontation began. The public conversation often returned to the same question. Who was Kelly Thomas before that night? The answer mattered. Not because mental illness excuses every action. Nor because homelessness defines someone's character. But because understanding the person behind the headlines changes the way a story is remembered. Headlines reduce people to a single moment. Real lives are always larger than that. Kelly's daily routine reflected the rhythms of the city itself. Mornings often began near the transportation center. He wandered through downtown streets where familiar shop owners recognized him. Sometimes he searched trash bins for recyclable containers worth a few cents each. Sometimes he accepted food from local charities. Sometimes he simply sat quietly, watching people hurry through lives that seemed impossibly distant from his own. Most commuters barely noticed him. Many homeless individuals become invisible in busy cities. People glance briefly before looking away. Not always from cruelty. Sometimes from discomfort. Sometimes because acknowledging another person's suffering feels overwhelming. Sometimes because modern life trains people to keep walking. Kelly lived inside that invisibility. Until one night, when he suddenly became impossible to ignore. The relationship between Fullerton police officers and the local homeless population had long been a subject of discussion within the community. Officers regularly responded to complaints involving trespassing, public intoxication, disturbances, or suspicious activity. Many interactions ended peacefully. Some involved citations or arrests. Police officers faced genuine challenges. Every call arrived with incomplete information. Dispatchers relayed reports from witnesses who could be mistaken, frightened, or lacking important context. An officer arriving at a scene often had only seconds to evaluate whether someone represented a threat. Mental illness complicated those encounters. Behavior that appeared aggressive could actually reflect confusion. Failure to follow commands might result from fear rather than defiance. Rapid movements might be attempts to escape terrifying hallucinations instead of efforts to attack. Modern policing increasingly recognizes these complexities, but in 2011 specialized crisis intervention training was far less widespread than it is today. The gap between law enforcement and mental health services remained enormous. Many officers found themselves responding to psychiatric crises because no one else was available. Critics argued police were being asked to solve medical problems. Supporters argued officers had little choice when public safety concerns arose. Those broader debates formed the unseen backdrop to everything that happened in Fullerton. Yet none of that was visible on the surface. To someone walking through downtown that summer, Fullerton appeared peaceful. Restaurants filled with evening customers. College students laughed outside cafes. Families attended baseball games. Music drifted from local bars. Children rode bicycles through suburban streets. The city looked like countless others across Southern California. Beneath that appearance, however, small tensions existed. Residents occasionally complained about homelessness near businesses. Business owners worried about customers feeling uncomfortable. Advocates urged greater compassion and expanded mental health resources. Police departments balanced competing expectations. Enforce the law. Protect vulnerable individuals. Keep public spaces safe. Avoid unnecessary force. Respond quickly. Show restraint. Those expectations sometimes collided in ways no policy manual could fully resolve. Kelly Thomas unknowingly stood at the center of those competing pressures. He did not become famous because of who he was. He became famous because of what happened to him. But before history attached itself to his name, he was simply another man trying to make it through another California summer. Another evening. Another night near the transportation center. Another routine that had repeated itself countless times before. No newspaper photographer waited nearby. No television cameras stood ready. No one imagined that surveillance cameras mounted high above the station were quietly recording a sequence of events that would soon be examined by millions. The city settled into another warm July evening. Streetlights flickered on one by one. Shadows stretched across the parking lot. Passengers boarded the last trains home. Police officers continued answering calls throughout Fullerton, expecting nothing more extraordinary than another shift nearing its end. Somewhere nearby, Kelly Thomas adjusted the backpack that carried nearly everything he owned. He had no way of knowing that within the hour, his name would become part of one of the most controversial police use of force cases in modern California history. Neither did the officers who would soon arrive. At least not yet. For the moment, everyone remained inside what appeared to be an ordinary evening. History was still only minutes away before Kelly Thomas became a name spoken during protests, courtroom arguments, and national debates about policing in America. He was simply a person trying to navigate a life that had become much harder than anyone around him could have imagined. The image that many people would later see on television was difficult to forget: a homeless man with a long beard, standing near a train station, caught in a confrontation that would end in tragedy. But that image represented only the final chapter. It did not show the child he once was. It did not show the young man who had dreams. It did not show the son whose father spent years trying to pull him back from a disease that slowly changed the direction of his life. Kelly Thomas was born in 1974 in California. Like many children growing up in Southern California, his early years were filled with ordinary experiences. There were family gatherings, friendships, school memories, and the small moments that build a person's identity long before the world knows their name. To his family, Kelly was not a headline. He was not a symbol. He was their son. Their brother. A person with his own personality, his own sense of humor, and his own place in the world. Those who knew Kelly before his illness described someone who could be warm and approachable. He enjoyed talking with people. He had a personality that could draw others into conversation. He was not someone whose future appeared destined to be spent sleeping near a transportation center. The path from a normal childhood to homelessness was not a straight line. It was a gradual collapse. A slow series of losses that happened over years. And at the center of that collapse was a condition that Kelly never chose. Schizophrenia. For many people, schizophrenia is misunderstood because it cannot be seen. A broken bone appears on an X-ray. A physical injury can be photographed. But mental illness often exists beneath the surface, changing a person's perception of reality in ways invisible to everyone around them. For Kelly, schizophrenia meant that the world inside his mind could become just as powerful, and sometimes more powerful, than the world everyone else experienced. Thoughts could become overwhelming. Fear could appear without warning. Reality could become uncertain. The symptoms were not simply moments of sadness or stress. They affected his ability to maintain stability, relationships, and independence. His family watched as the illness slowly began taking away pieces of the person they remembered. For parents, there is perhaps no greater pain than watching a child struggle with something they cannot physically fight. Ron Thomas, Kelly's father, knew the frustration of trying to help someone who sometimes could not recognize they needed help. Ron had experience in law enforcement. He understood danger, crisis situations, and difficult decisions. Throughout his career, he had seen people during some of the worst moments of their lives. But nothing prepared him for the emotional battle of watching his own son disappear behind the symptoms of mental illness. A police officer can respond to a stranger's emergency. A father has to live with it every day. Ron attempted to help Kelly find treatment. There were moments when it appeared things might improve. There were periods when Kelly received medication and support. There were times when the family hoped stability had finally returned. But schizophrenia often creates one of the most difficult challenges in mental health care. The illness itself can prevent people from understanding they are ill. A person may stop taking medication because they believe they no longer need it. They may reject help because the world they experience feels completely logical to them. To family members watching from the outside, it can feel like reaching through a locked door. You can see the person you love. You know they are still there. But you cannot find the key to bring them back. Over time, Kelly struggled to maintain a stable life. Work became difficult. Housing became uncertain. Relationships became harder to preserve. The systems designed to help people with severe mental illness often failed those who needed them most. Hospitals could stabilize someone temporarily. Shelters could provide a bed for a night. Charities could offer food and clothing. But long-term solutions required consistency, resources, and support that were often unavailable. Eventually, Kelly found himself living on the streets. For many people, homelessness is viewed only through the final image. A person sleeping outside. A person asking for money. A person walking through downtown carrying a bag. But homelessness is rarely where a story begins. It is usually where a story ends after many earlier chapters. Kelly's homelessness was the result of years of struggle. It was not simply a choice. It was not proof that someone had failed morally. It was the visible result of invisible battles. Living outside changed almost every part of Kelly's existence. Privacy disappeared. Security disappeared. Comfort disappeared. The smallest necessities became daily challenges. Where would he sleep? Where would he find food? Where could he wash? Where could he keep his belongings safe? A backpack was no longer just a backpack. It was his entire world. Everything important had to fit inside it. For people living without shelter, every interaction matters. A kind word from a stranger can become a moment of dignity. A harsh reaction can reinforce the feeling of being forgotten. Around Fullerton, Kelly became a familiar presence. Some people ignored him. Some people helped him. Some people worried about him. Many simply knew him as the man who walked around downtown. But those who interacted with him often described a person who was not threatening. They described someone who was struggling. A local business owner might see him passing by and offer him something to eat. A resident might recognize him and say hello. A person working near the transportation center might see him sitting quietly and talking to himself. These moments rarely made news. They were ordinary. But they revealed something important. Kelly was still connected to the community around him. Even in the midst of illness and homelessness, he was not completely alone. People knew him. People remembered him. People saw more than the condition that affected him. One of the most painful aspects of Kelly's story is that his final moments would eventually become far more famous than his entire life. Millions of people would watch the footage from the night he encountered police. Millions would hear his desperate words. Millions would debate what happened. But far fewer people would know about the years before that night. The struggles. The attempts at recovery. The family who continued loving him despite circumstances they could not control. The person behind the controversy. That is the danger of reducing someone to a single event. A person's final moments can become louder than their entire existence. Kelly's story was not created on July 5, 2011. That night only revealed the tragedy that had been building for years. It revealed the intersection of several complicated realities. A man living with severe mental illness. A homeless population struggling for support. A police department responding to uncertain circumstances. A system where mental health crises often became law enforcement encounters. Each element alone was complicated. Together, they created a situation where every decision carried enormous consequences. In the weeks after Kelly's death, people would ask many questions. Why was he approached? Why did the interaction escalate? Could different training have changed the outcome? Could someone with mental health expertise have handled the situation differently? Could the officers have recognized that Kelly was experiencing a crisis rather than a threat? These questions became part of a larger national conversation. But before Kelly became a symbol, he was a man. A man who once had hopes. A man whose father fought for him. A man whose illness changed his path but did not erase his humanity. The tragedy of Kelly Thomas is not only found in what happened during those final minutes at the Fullerton Transportation Center. The tragedy also exists in everything that came before. The years when a person slowly disappeared from the life he once knew. The years when his family tried to help. The years when a community saw him but could not fully save him. On the evening of July 5, 2011, Kelly walked through Fullerton carrying the weight of a lifetime of struggles. He was not walking toward history. He was not walking toward becoming a national symbol. He was simply moving through another day. Another night. Another uncertain moment in a life that had already been filled with battles most people never saw. But somewhere ahead, beneath the bright lights of the transportation center, an encounter was waiting. An encounter that would transform Kelly Thomas from a forgotten figure into one of the most discussed names in America's debate over police force and mental health. And within minutes, the quiet struggles of one man's life would collide with the power of the state. The result would change Fullerton forever. July 5, 2011, began like countless other summer days in Southern California. The heat of the afternoon slowly disappeared as the sun moved toward the horizon. The streets of Fullerton became quieter. Families returned home after dinner. Businesses began closing their doors. The energy of the city shifted from the movement of daytime activity into the slower rhythm of evening. But at the Fullerton Transportation Center, life continued. The station was never completely empty. Even after the busiest commuter hours had passed, people moved through the area. Some waited for late buses. Others walked toward nearby streets. Security lights illuminated sections of the parking area, creating bright patches surrounded by darkness. For someone passing through quickly, it looked ordinary. For Kelly Thomas, it was familiar territory. He knew the station. He knew the corners where people gathered. He knew the quiet moments when the crowds disappeared. That evening, Kelly was there like many other nights before. He carried his backpack. He wore no shirt. His appearance reflected his difficult circumstances, but to those familiar with him, it was not unusual. Kelly often struggled with maintaining daily routines because of his mental illness and unstable living situation. He was not a stranger to the area. But on this night, someone made a phone call that would set events in motion. A report came to the Fullerton Police Department regarding suspicious activity near vehicles at the transportation center. The information reaching officers suggested that someone might have been attempting to open car doors. For police officers, these kinds of calls require immediate attention. Vehicle-related crimes can happen quickly. A person checking door handles may be looking for unlocked cars. A suspicious individual in a parking area at night may raise concerns. Officers responding to such calls often have limited information. They do not know what happened before they arrive. They do not know exactly who they will encounter. They must make decisions based on the information available at that moment. The officers assigned to investigate included Manuel Ramos and Joseph Wolfe. They arrived at the transportation center expecting to handle what appeared to be a routine investigation. A suspicious person. A possible property crime. A situation requiring questions and observation. Nothing suggested that the encounter would become one of the most controversial police incidents in California history. When Ramos and Wolfe approached Kelly, the first moments did not immediately appear violent. The officers began speaking with him. Kelly responded. The conversation involved questions about what he was doing in the area and why he appeared to be checking vehicles. From the officers' perspective, they were attempting to determine whether a crime had occurred. From Kelly's perspective, the interaction was happening through the lens of a man living with schizophrenia, a condition that could affect his understanding of situations and authority figures. The difference between those two perspectives would become central to the debate that followed. During the encounter, officers searched through Kelly's backpack. Inside were personal belongings, including several pieces of mail. Some of the envelopes did not have Kelly's name on them. This raised suspicion among the officers. They questioned whether Kelly had taken the items from vehicles or mailboxes. Later, prosecutors and defense attorneys would interpret these moments very differently. To prosecutors, the evidence of wrongdoing was weak and did not justify what followed. To the defense, the officers were responding to circumstances that appeared suspicious during a nighttime investigation. The tension between those interpretations would become one of the defining issues of the case. At first, the interaction remained verbal. Questions were asked. Answers were given. But gradually, the tone changed. The situation became more confrontational. The words exchanged between Manuel Ramos and Kelly Thomas would later become some of the most analyzed moments from that night. Because unlike many police encounters, this one was not remembered only through witness testimony. It was captured through recordings. The voices from that evening would echo long after the physical confrontation ended. According to recordings from the incident, Ramos said words that would become infamous. "Do you see my fists?" Kelly responded, "Yeah." Then Ramos said, "They're getting ready to F you up." Those words became a major focus during public discussions of the case. To many critics, the statement represented a disturbing escalation, suggesting that the encounter had moved beyond investigation into intimidation. To supporters of the officers, the statement was interpreted differently, as part of a tense exchange occurring during a confrontation where officers believed they needed control. The meaning of those words became something debated repeatedly in courtrooms and public conversations. But the most important question was not only what was said. It was what happened next. Within moments, the situation moved from conversation to physical confrontation. Ramos attempted to take control of Kelly. Kelly resisted. Exactly how those seconds unfolded became one of the central disputes during the later trial. Police officers are trained to respond when individuals resist commands. But questions about proportionality became unavoidable. Was Kelly actively threatening officers? Was he resisting because of confusion and fear? Could the situation have been controlled differently? Those questions would remain at the heart of the controversy. As the struggle began, additional officers were called to the scene. The situation that had started with 2 officers became a larger police response. More officers arrived. More force was used. The number of people involved increased. And with every additional person entering the confrontation, the possibility of the situation calming became more difficult. Within minutes, Kelly was surrounded. The man who had spent years being known around Fullerton as a confused but familiar homeless resident was now at the center of a rapidly escalating police encounter. The surveillance cameras above the transportation center continued recording. They captured the movements, the positions of the officers, the struggle on the ground. The images would later become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire case. But on that night, those cameras were simply silent witnesses. They recorded without judgment, without explanation, without emotion. They captured only what happened. As more officers joined the confrontation, Kelly's voice could be heard. He apologized. He pleaded. He called out. The words that would later haunt many viewers came from a person who appeared terrified and overwhelmed. "I'm sorry. I'm trying. Help me, Dad." Those cries became some of the most painful moments connected to the case. For Kelly's family, hearing those words meant hearing their son reaching for the person who had always tried to protect him. For the public, the words transformed the incident from an abstract debate about police procedure into something deeply human. A frightened man calling for his father. As the confrontation continued, officers used various physical control methods. Kelly was struck. He was shocked with a taser. Officers attempted to restrain him. The struggle continued for several minutes. The exact interpretation of those actions would later divide prosecutors, defense attorneys, police officials, and the public. The prosecution argued that the level of force used was excessive and unnecessary, particularly given Kelly's condition and the number of officers involved. The defense argued that the officers were responding to resistance and attempting to gain control of a difficult situation. The courtroom would eventually become the place where those competing narratives collided. But before lawyers debated evidence, before experts analyzed injuries, before jurors considered the facts, there was only the scene itself. A dark transportation center. A group of officers. A man on the ground. A confrontation growing more intense with every passing second. By the time emergency responders arrived, Kelly Thomas was in critical condition. The physical damage was severe. The man who had walked into that encounter alive would leave it unconscious and fighting for survival. The officers involved would later face criminal charges. The city of Fullerton would face public outrage. The police department would face intense scrutiny. And Kelly's family would begin a journey no family should ever experience. They would enter hospitals, courtrooms, press conferences. They would listen as strangers debated the final moments of someone they loved. But before any of that happened, there was one final devastating reality. Kelly Thomas was still alive. For 5 days, doctors fought to save him. His family hoped for a recovery. They waited beside him. They prayed. They searched for signs that Kelly, the son, the friend, the person behind the headlines, could somehow return. But the injuries he suffered were too severe. On July 10, 2011, Kelly Thomas died. The quiet summer evening that began with a routine police call ended with a death that would shake a city and eventually draw attention from across America. A man who had spent years invisible became impossible to ignore. The cameras had captured the encounter. The recordings preserved the voices. The evidence remained. And now the question was no longer what happened. The question was why. In the days after July 5, 2011, the city of Fullerton tried to understand what had happened at its transportation center. At first, the incident existed only through fragments. A police report. Brief statements. A few lines describing an encounter that had ended with a man hospitalized in critical condition. To people who had not witnessed it, the details were incomplete. A homeless man. A police response. A struggle. A hospital bed. But as investigators began collecting evidence, the story became far more complicated. Because hidden inside those ordinary details were pieces of a much larger picture. And among the most important pieces were images that had been recorded silently above the station. The surveillance cameras. For years, cameras around public transportation facilities had existed for one simple purpose: security. They were designed to deter crime, assist investigations, and provide information after incidents occurred. They were not designed to tell stories. They did not capture emotions. They did not record thoughts. They did not explain intentions. They simply recorded movement. But on the night of July 5, 2011, those cameras became the closest thing the public had to a witness. The footage showed a scene that would later be examined repeatedly by investigators, attorneys, journalists, and community members. Every movement mattered. Every second became important. Every action was questioned. The footage did not answer every question. But it changed the conversation. Because without it, the public would have been forced to rely almost entirely on official accounts and eyewitness memories. With it, people could see parts of the encounter for themselves. The investigation quickly began focusing on what happened during those final minutes before Kelly was transported away. Investigators examined the actions of each officer involved. They looked at the timeline. They studied positions. They analyzed the amount of force used. They reviewed the communication between officers. They searched for answers. What led the encounter from a conversation to a physical confrontation? At what point did officers believe Kelly had become a threat? At what point did the situation stop being a routine investigation and become a struggle? Those questions would eventually become central to the criminal case. But before prosecutors and defense attorneys argued over interpretations, investigators had to reconstruct the night piece by piece. The first challenge was understanding Kelly himself. Who was he? What was his condition? What was his state of mind? Because the circumstances surrounding Kelly were unlike a typical police encounter. Investigators knew that Kelly was living with schizophrenia. They knew he had a history of homelessness. They knew people who encountered him regularly often described him as confused but not violent. His mental health history became a crucial part of understanding the encounter. A person experiencing a psychiatric crisis may react differently from someone without that condition. Commands that appear simple to an officer may be confusing or frightening to someone experiencing hallucinations, paranoia, or disorganized thinking. A delay in responding may not mean defiance. A strange statement may not mean hostility. Fear may not look like fear. Sometimes it looks like resistance. Sometimes it looks like unpredictability. And sometimes it creates a dangerous misunderstanding between two people who believe they are responding appropriately. Investigators also examined the original call that brought officers to the transportation center. The report involved suspicious activity around vehicles. But as more details emerged, questions developed about what exactly had been reported and how serious the situation actually was. Had a crime occurred? Was Kelly truly attempting to break into cars? Or had suspicion grown beyond the available evidence? The answer mattered because police use of force decisions are often judged within the context of the threat officers believe they are facing. If officers believed they were dealing with a criminal actively resisting arrest, their actions would be viewed differently than if they were dealing with a confused individual experiencing a mental health crisis. That distinction would become one of the most important arguments in the case. Meanwhile, Kelly's condition continued to worsen. Inside the hospital, doctors fought to keep him alive. His injuries were extensive. The man who had been standing at the transportation center hours earlier was now unconscious and dependent on medical care. His family waited. They hoped. They searched for any sign that he would recover. But the damage was catastrophic. Kelly suffered severe injuries to his head and face. He had multiple fractures. He experienced serious trauma that affected his ability to survive independently. Doctors worked, but the possibility of recovery became increasingly unlikely. For his father, Ron Thomas, the situation was unbearable. He had spent years trying to protect his son from a disease that took pieces of his life away. Now he was facing something completely different. His son was not fighting an invisible illness anymore. He was fighting injuries that could be seen. Injuries caused during an encounter with people who were supposed to protect the community. The pain was made even more complicated by Ron's own background. As a former law enforcement officer, he understood the challenges police faced. He understood that officers sometimes had to make difficult decisions quickly. But he also understood something else. The person lying in the hospital was his son. Not a case number. Not a suspect. Not a situation. His child. As the investigation continued, public attention began growing. News of the incident spread through Fullerton. At first, many residents knew only limited information. Some supported the officers. Others immediately questioned what had happened. Then the footage began circulating. The recorded images and audio transformed the discussion. People who had previously heard only descriptions were now seeing and hearing parts of the encounter themselves. The reaction was immediate. Many viewers were shocked by the intensity of the confrontation. They focused on the number of officers involved. They focused on Kelly's words. They focused on the length of the struggle. They focused on the contrast between the person described by community members and the person portrayed in official discussions. The debate became emotional. For some, the incident represented a failure to properly handle someone experiencing mental illness. For others, it represented the difficult reality officers face when dealing with unpredictable situations. The divide grew wider. But one thing became increasingly clear. The case would not disappear. As Kelly's condition remained critical, investigators continued gathering evidence. They interviewed witnesses who had been near the transportation center. They reviewed statements from officers. They examined medical records. They studied the surveillance footage. They analyzed every available detail. A criminal investigation requires more than emotion. It requires proving specific legal questions. What did each person know? What did each person believe? What actions were taken? Were those actions justified under the law? The investigation had to move beyond public anger and into a courtroom standard. That process would take months. But before any trial could begin, one event changed everything. On July 10, 2011, Kelly Thomas died. His death transformed the investigation. A police encounter that had already raised concerns became a possible criminal case. The questions became more serious. The consequences became greater. A person who had been struggling quietly on the streets became the center of a national discussion about police accountability. The medical examiner's findings would become a major part of what followed. The injuries documented after Kelly's death would be analyzed by experts. The cause of death would become a key issue. The prosecution would argue that the injuries resulted from unnecessary and excessive force. The defense would argue that the officers were responding to resistance and following their training. Two completely different interpretations of the same night. Two competing explanations. One tragic outcome. Kelly's death also changed the atmosphere in Fullerton. Residents who previously had little involvement with city politics began demanding answers. Community members asked why such a violent encounter had occurred. They questioned whether the police department had properly supervised its officers. They questioned whether complaints about law enforcement behavior had been taken seriously enough. The controversy expanded beyond the individual officers. It became a discussion about the entire system. How does a city hold police accountable? How should departments investigate their own officers? Who protects vulnerable people when they are in crisis? Those questions were no longer theoretical. For Fullerton, they had become painfully real. In the weeks that followed, Kelly Thomas became more than the man who died at a train station. His photograph appeared at demonstrations. His name was written on signs. His story was shared by people who had never met him. Some saw him as a symbol of police misconduct. Others saw him as a reminder of the failures surrounding mental health care in America. But behind every debate was one undeniable fact. A family had lost someone they loved. A community had lost trust. And investigators now had to determine whether what happened that night was a tragic consequence of a difficult encounter, or a crime. The answer would come through evidence. Through testimony. Through the slow and demanding process of justice. And the first major step toward that answer was already underway. The evidence had been collected. The footage had been reviewed. The questions had been raised. Now, the investigation would begin searching for the truth hidden inside those final minutes at the Fullerton Transportation Center. Kelly Thomas had been dead for only a matter of hours when the investigation entered an entirely different phase. The focus was no longer on saving a life. It was on understanding how that life had ended. Inside the Fullerton Police Department, officers completed reports, reviewed procedures, and prepared for the scrutiny that was rapidly approaching. Outside the department, rumors spread faster than confirmed facts. Every new piece of information seemed to raise two more questions. Every witness remembered something slightly different. Every conversation in coffee shops, restaurants, and neighborhood gatherings eventually found its way back to the same subject. What really happened that night? The answer would prove far more complicated than anyone expected. For investigators, the first task was establishing an accurate timeline. Dispatch records documented when the original call had been received. Radio transmissions showed when officers arrived. Surveillance footage provided timestamps that allowed investigators to reconstruct the sequence of events. Medical records established Kelly's condition immediately after the encounter. Individually, each piece of evidence told only part of the story. Together, they formed the framework upon which the entire case would rest. The challenge was that no single piece of evidence answered every question. The surveillance cameras captured movement but not every detail. The audio recordings preserved voices but not every action. Witnesses observed different portions of the struggle from different angles. The officers involved each described events from their own perspectives. The investigators had to determine where those accounts overlapped, where they conflicted, and why. The original reporting party also became important. Investigators revisited the circumstances surrounding the suspicious person call that had brought officers to the transportation center. The report suggested someone had been trying vehicle door handles. Yet proving precisely what Kelly had been doing before officers arrived was difficult. No evidence emerged showing that any vehicle had actually been stolen that night. Nor did investigators establish that Kelly had committed a violent offense before police made contact with him. That distinction mattered, because everything that followed began with a relatively low-level investigation. This had not started as the pursuit of an armed suspect. It had not begun with reports of an assault. It had not involved an active shooting or hostage situation. The encounter began as officers responding to a report of suspicious behavior. That fact would remain central throughout the investigation. Attention soon shifted toward the officers themselves. The names Manuel Ramos, Jay Cicinelli, and Joseph Wolf quickly became known far beyond Orange County. Investigators reviewed each officer's actions separately rather than treating the confrontation as one collective event. That approach was essential. Criminal responsibility depends on individual conduct. Each officer's decisions had to be evaluated independently. Each use of force had to be examined within the context of what that officer knew and did at that specific moment. Manuel Ramos had been the first officer to engage Kelly. His verbal interaction before the physical struggle immediately became a major point of interest. Investigators carefully reviewed the recording containing the statement about his fists. The language was unmistakably aggressive. What investigators had to determine, however, was whether those words reflected unlawful intent or represented an attempt, however poorly expressed, to gain compliance during a tense encounter. Intent is rarely visible. It must often be inferred from actions, circumstances, and surrounding evidence. Jay Cicinelli's role became equally significant. By the time he entered the confrontation, the struggle was already underway. Investigators examined testimony regarding his repeated use of the taser and allegations that he struck Kelly multiple times with the device. Medical evidence became especially important in evaluating those claims. If injuries matched witness descriptions, they could support portions of the prosecution's eventual theory. If not, the defense would argue that assumptions had replaced facts. Joseph Wolf's actions were also reviewed in detail. Although his legal path would later differ from the other officers, investigators nevertheless analyzed his participation during the struggle. No one involved escaped scrutiny. Every movement became evidence. Every decision became a subject of analysis. Meanwhile, detectives began interviewing civilian witnesses. Some had been waiting for transportation. Others happened to be nearby. Several described hearing shouting before they understood what was happening. Others remembered seeing multiple officers surrounding a single man. Some recalled Kelly screaming repeatedly. Human memory, however, is imperfect. People under stress often remember the emotional impact of an event more clearly than its exact sequence. One witness might confidently remember an officer striking Kelly first. Another might remember Kelly resisting before additional force was used. Neither witness necessarily intended to mislead investigators. Traumatic events often fragment memory. Investigators therefore compared every statement against physical evidence and recorded footage. No single witness controlled the narrative. The evidence had to speak collectively. As news coverage intensified, national media outlets arrived in Fullerton. Satellite trucks lined nearby streets. Television reporters stood outside police headquarters delivering live broadcasts. The case no longer belonged solely to one community. America was watching. Journalists dug into department records. Questions emerged about previous complaints involving members of the Fullerton Police Department. Community activists argued that Kelly's death reflected broader cultural problems within policing. Police supporters warned against reaching conclusions before the investigation finished. The atmosphere became increasingly polarized. Within days, public trust had begun to erode. Many residents wondered whether the department could objectively investigate its own officers. That concern eventually led outside agencies and prosecutors to play significant roles in reviewing the evidence. Transparency became almost as important as the investigation itself. Without public confidence, even accurate conclusions risked being rejected. While investigators worked, Kelly's family entered a different kind of ordeal. They were no longer waiting beside a hospital bed. Now they were preparing for a funeral. Grief collided with unanswered questions. Every interview shown on television reopened emotional wounds. Every new report forced them to relive the worst week of their lives. Ron Thomas became one of the most recognizable voices demanding accountability. His background in law enforcement gave his words unusual weight. He spoke not only as a grieving father but also as someone who understood police procedures. That combination made his public statements particularly powerful. He insisted that what happened to Kelly could not simply be dismissed as an unfortunate incident. He wanted answers. He wanted accountability. Most of all, he wanted people to remember that the man at the center of the investigation had been his son. Not merely a homeless individual. Not merely a police suspect. His son. As investigators continued reviewing evidence, medical experts completed extensive examinations. The injuries documented during the autopsy became critical. Multiple facial fractures. Significant head trauma. Injuries consistent with prolonged physical struggle. Evidence of impaired breathing. The forensic findings did not determine criminal guilt. That responsibility belonged to the courts. But they established the medical reality prosecutors would later rely upon. Experts would eventually disagree over aspects of causation. Defense witnesses questioned whether every injury resulted from specific actions alleged by prosecutors. The prosecution argued that the cumulative force applied during the encounter directly caused Kelly's death. The courtroom battle was already beginning long before any jury entered the building. Behind closed doors, prosecutors carefully evaluated whether criminal charges could be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Public outrage alone could never justify prosecution. Evidence had to support each legal element of every potential charge. That required patience. Months of review followed. Investigators rewatched surveillance recordings countless times. Audio specialists enhanced recordings. Medical experts prepared reports. Witnesses were re-interviewed. Every inconsistency had to be explained. Every uncertainty had to be acknowledged. The investigation was moving deliberately because the consequences would be enormous. Charging police officers with serious crimes is exceptionally rare and legally complex. Officers are authorized to use force under many circumstances. The law therefore requires prosecutors to demonstrate not merely that force caused injury, but that the force exceeded lawful authority under the circumstances. It is an exceptionally high legal threshold. The evidence had to meet it. Meanwhile, Fullerton itself was changing. City council meetings filled with angry residents. Community members demanded independent oversight. Faith leaders organized vigils. Civil rights organizations called for reform. The transportation center, once an ordinary commuter hub, became a place where flowers, handwritten notes, and candles appeared. People who had never spoken to Kelly while he was alive now stopped to remember him after his death. The irony was painful. In life, many had walked past him without noticing. In death, millions would learn his name. Months passed. The investigation continued. Speculation never stopped. Some believed indictments were inevitable. Others insisted the officers would ultimately be cleared. Few realized just how unusual the next chapter would become. When prosecutors finally announced criminal charges against multiple Fullerton police officers, the decision sent shockwaves through law enforcement agencies across the United States. Cases involving officer-involved deaths rarely reached that stage. This one had. The investigation had moved beyond public debate, beyond internal review, beyond administrative discipline. Now, it was entering the criminal justice system itself. The search for facts had become a search for criminal responsibility. And soon, every piece of evidence collected over those long months would be tested in open court, where every word, every recording, every injury, and every decision made on that July night would face the most demanding scrutiny the legal system could provide. For weeks after Kelly Thomas died, Fullerton existed under a cloud of uncertainty. Every day seemed to bring another demonstration, another television crew, another community meeting filled with angry residents demanding answers. The questions never changed. Would anyone be held accountable? Would the officers involved simply return to work? Or would this case become another tragedy that faded from public attention? Behind closed doors, prosecutors from the Orange County District Attorney's Office were asking different questions. Not whether the public was angry. Not whether the incident had become national news. But whether the evidence met the legal standard required to file criminal charges. The distinction mattered. Public outrage and criminal guilt are not the same thing. A prosecutor cannot file charges simply because a case has become controversial. The evidence must establish probable cause. Every decision had to withstand legal scrutiny. Every charge had to be supported by facts that could survive a courtroom challenge. The investigation had grown enormous. Thousands of pages of reports filled evidence files. Hours of surveillance footage had been reviewed repeatedly. Audio recordings had been enhanced and analyzed. Medical experts had examined every injury. Civilian witnesses had been interviewed. Police officers had provided statements. Specialists in use of force practices had been consulted. No shortcut existed. Every minute of the confrontation had been reconstructed as carefully as possible. The prosecutors understood something that everyone else did as well. Whatever decision they reached would be examined for years. If they declined to prosecute, many would accuse the justice system of protecting police officers. If they filed charges without sufficient evidence, the case could collapse in court. Neither outcome would serve justice. The pressure was immense. Inside the district attorney's office, attorneys reviewed one issue over and over again. The amount of force used. Police officers are legally permitted to use force under certain circumstances. The law recognizes that officers often face unpredictable situations. People resist arrest. Suspects flee. Violence can erupt without warning. Force itself is not automatically unlawful. The legal question is whether the force used was objectively reasonable under the circumstances known to the officers at that moment. That standard would become the foundation of the entire case. Investigators compared Kelly's actions with the officers' responses. They examined how the confrontation escalated. They analyzed each phase separately rather than treating the struggle as one continuous event. When did verbal commands become physical restraint? When did restraint become repeated strikes? When did the level of force exceed what prosecutors believed the evidence could justify? Those questions shaped every decision that followed. Medical findings became especially important. The autopsy documented devastating injuries. Kelly had suffered multiple fractures to his face. His nose was broken. His head had sustained severe trauma. His brain had experienced oxygen deprivation. The medical examiner ultimately concluded that Kelly died from mechanical compression of the chest that impaired breathing, combined with blunt force injuries to the head and neck sustained during the confrontation. The prosecution viewed those findings as critical. The defense would later challenge aspects of that interpretation. But for prosecutors deciding whether to file charges, the medical evidence strengthened their conclusion that the encounter deserved criminal review. The recordings also became impossible to ignore. By now, much of America had heard portions of the audio. One exchange, in particular, had become infamous. Manuel Ramos asking Kelly whether he saw his fists. Kelly answering quietly. Then Ramos warning that those fists were preparing to hurt him. The recording spread across television broadcasts and internet discussions. For many listeners, it was deeply disturbing. Critics argued that it reflected an unnecessary escalation before significant force had even been used. Supporters of the officers argued that isolated statements should not be separated from the broader context of a rapidly evolving confrontation. Prosecutors had to evaluate the recording not emotionally, but legally. Could those words help establish intent? Could they demonstrate an unreasonable approach? Or were they simply evidence of a tense interaction during a difficult arrest? Again, there were no easy answers. Meanwhile, pressure outside the courthouse continued building. Community activists organized larger demonstrations. Civil rights organizations demanded transparency. Mental health advocates pointed to Kelly's schizophrenia as evidence that police departments required better crisis intervention training. Homeless advocacy groups argued that vulnerable people were too often treated as public safety problems rather than individuals needing assistance. The case had expanded far beyond one confrontation. It had become a national conversation about policing itself. Inside Fullerton City Hall, political consequences were already unfolding. Public confidence in city leadership deteriorated rapidly. Residents questioned whether officials had adequately supervised the police department. Town hall meetings became emotional. Citizens lined up for hours to speak. Some addressed the council through tears. Others spoke with visible anger. Nearly everyone wanted accountability. The pressure eventually contributed to a successful recall election removing several members of the Fullerton City Council. Although separate from the criminal case, the political upheaval demonstrated how profoundly Kelly's death had affected the community. The investigation had changed the city. Now it was about to change the lives of the officers involved as well. On September 21, 2011, Orange County District Attorney Tony Rackauckas announced the filing of criminal charges. The announcement drew national attention. It was an extraordinary decision. Police officers are rarely prosecuted for actions taken while performing their duties. When charges are filed, they often involve overwhelming evidence or highly unusual circumstances. This case met the prosecutor's threshold. Manuel Ramos was charged with second-degree murder and involuntary manslaughter. The charges reflected the prosecution's belief that the evidence supported allegations that his actions had unlawfully contributed to Kelly's death. Jay Cicinelli was charged with involuntary manslaughter and excessive use of force. Prosecutors alleged that his repeated use of the taser, including striking Kelly with it during the struggle, formed part of the unlawful conduct. Joseph Wolf was initially charged with involuntary manslaughter and use of excessive force as well. For Kelly's family, the announcement represented only the beginning. Charges did not guarantee convictions. They simply meant that prosecutors believed the evidence deserved to be presented before a jury. Still, after months of uncertainty, the decision provided something the family had desperately sought: the opportunity for the facts to be examined publicly. The officers, meanwhile, maintained that they had acted lawfully. Their attorneys emphasized that police officers often make split-second decisions under difficult circumstances. They argued that Kelly resisted arrest and that the officers responded according to their training. They rejected the accusation that anyone intended to cause Kelly's death. The legal battle lines had now been drawn. The prosecution would argue that excessive force caused a preventable death. The defense would argue that officers confronted a rapidly evolving and dangerous situation requiring decisive action. Between those competing narratives stood a jury that had not yet been selected. Before trial could begin, another process unfolded. Administrative action. Independent of the criminal proceedings, the Fullerton Police Department conducted internal reviews. Although criminal guilt had not been determined, administrative standards differ from criminal law. Ultimately, Manuel Ramos, J. Cicinelli, and Joseph Wolfe were dismissed from the department. The decisions reflected departmental conclusions regarding policy and conduct rather than criminal liability. Each officer challenged the termination through legal and administrative appeals. Those efforts would continue for years. But the dismissals demonstrated that the consequences extended beyond the courtroom. Careers ended. Reputations changed forever. For the prosecution, however, the greatest challenge still lay ahead. Winning public approval is not the same as proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Courtrooms operate under rules fundamentally different from public opinion. Jurors receive instructions. Evidence must be admitted according to strict legal standards. Witnesses face cross-examination. Expert opinions are challenged. Every weakness in the prosecution's case becomes an opportunity for the defense. The months leading toward trial were consumed with preparation. Prosecutors organized thousands of exhibits. Defense attorneys developed competing interpretations of nearly every important fact. Medical experts prepared to explain complex injuries. Police training specialists reviewed departmental procedures. Civilian witnesses refreshed fading memories. The surveillance footage would be played again. The recordings would be heard again. Kelly's final words would once more echo through another room. This time, however, the audience would not be television viewers. It would be 12 jurors whose decisions would shape the future of everyone involved. Outside the courthouse, the nation continued watching. Some believed justice was finally moving forward. Others warned against convicting officers based on emotion rather than law. The divide remained sharp. The courtroom would now become the place where those opposing beliefs met. The evidence had been gathered. The charges had been filed. The investigation was over. The trial was about to begin. And inside that courtroom, every second of one July night would be examined with extraordinary precision, as the legal system confronted one of the most controversial police use of force cases of its time. More than 2 years had passed since the night Kelly Thomas was beaten at the Fullerton Transportation Center. The flowers that once covered the sidewalk had long since disappeared. The television satellite trucks had moved on to other stories. The protest signs had become worn from months of demonstrations. But for Kelly's family, time had not brought closure. For the officers involved, it had not erased uncertainty. For the city of Fullerton, it had not restored trust. Everything had been leading to this moment. The courtroom. Unlike the streets outside City Hall or the crowds gathered during demonstrations, the courtroom demanded something different. Emotion alone carried no legal weight. Sympathy could not replace evidence. Anger could not substitute for proof. Inside those walls, every allegation would be tested. Every witness would be questioned. Every piece of evidence would be challenged. And at the end of the process, 12 jurors would decide whether the prosecution had proven its case beyond a reasonable doubt. The trial formally began in late 2013. Because of pre-trial rulings, the proceedings focused on Manuel Ramos and J. Cicinelli. The charges against Joseph Wolfe would later be dismissed after the verdicts in the Ramos and Cicinelli trial. Even before opening statements, the atmosphere inside the courtroom was tense. Rows of reporters filled the gallery. Legal analysts watched closely. Members of Kelly's family sat quietly, preparing to hear details they had already lived through countless times. Across the room sat the former officers whose careers and freedom now rested in the hands of strangers. There were no celebrations. No dramatic speeches. Only silence. The kind of silence that exists when everyone understands the importance of what is about to happen. The prosecution began by presenting the case as the story of a man who never should have died during what started as a relatively minor police encounter. Prosecutors argued that Kelly Thomas was vulnerable. He was homeless. He suffered from schizophrenia. He was confused. While acknowledging that Kelly resisted officers during parts of the confrontation, the prosecution argued that the amount of force used became excessive and ultimately fatal. Their theory was straightforward. Force that might be justified during the beginning of a struggle can become unlawful if it continues after the threat has significantly diminished. According to prosecutors, that line had been crossed again and again. The prosecution carefully walked jurors through the timeline. The original call. The initial contact. The search of Kelly's backpack. The increasingly aggressive language. The physical struggle. The arrival of additional officers. The repeated applications of force. The medical consequences. Rather than asking jurors to focus only on one punch or one strike, prosecutors encouraged them to examine the encounter as a whole. Each action, they argued, built upon the previous one until Kelly suffered injuries from which he never recovered. Then came the evidence that many people had already heard outside the courtroom. The audio recording. Inside the courtroom, the recording carried a different weight. Jurors listened carefully. No television commentary interrupted. No headlines summarized what they heard. Only the voices from that July night filled the room. The recording captured Manuel Ramos asking Kelly whether he could see his fists. Kelly answered. Then came the threat. The prosecution argued that the recording demonstrated an attitude inconsistent with an officer attempting to calmly de-escalate a situation. Instead, prosecutors suggested it reflected unnecessary aggression before the confrontation turned physical. Defense attorneys immediately challenged that interpretation. Words, they argued, cannot be evaluated in isolation. Police officers often speak firmly during confrontations. Stress changes language. Context matters. The defense reminded jurors that recordings preserve sound but not every circumstance surrounding it. The trial quickly became a battle over context. The surveillance footage followed. Unlike television viewers who had watched edited news reports, jurors viewed the evidence within the framework established by both sides. The prosecution highlighted moments where Kelly appeared overwhelmed. The defense emphasized moments they believed demonstrated resistance. The same video produced completely different conclusions depending upon which attorney was speaking. That is often the nature of courtroom litigation. Facts remain constant. Interpretations compete. Medical testimony occupied a significant portion of the trial. Doctors described Kelly's injuries in clinical detail. Photographs documented severe facial trauma. Experts explained fractures. Brain injuries. Evidence of oxygen deprivation. Compression affecting breathing. The testimony was difficult to hear. Each medical finding reinforced the severity of what Kelly had endured. The prosecution argued that these injuries reflected force far beyond what was necessary to control one individual. The defense did not dispute that Kelly's injuries were catastrophic. Instead, defense attorneys questioned whether the officers' actions were criminal under the difficult circumstances confronting them. Their argument rested heavily on police training and split-second decision-making. Officers are not granted the luxury of hindsight, they argued. They must make decisions in real time. While reviewing evidence years later allows every movement to be slowed, replayed, and analyzed repeatedly, officers at the scene had only seconds to respond. Defense experts testified regarding use of force principles. They explained how resistance can escalate encounters. They discussed officer safety. They emphasized that uncertainty often requires officers to make immediate judgments without knowing how events will unfold. The prosecution responded by pointing to the overwhelming numerical advantage. 6 officers. 1 man. They argued that whatever danger initially existed diminished as more officers gained physical control. The legal question became whether force continued after necessity had passed. Witnesses who had been present near the transportation center also testified. Some described hearing Kelly screaming. Others remembered seeing officers striking him. Defense attorneys challenged inconsistencies between different witnesses. Human memory, they reminded jurors, is imperfect. Traumatic events are difficult to recall with precision. Some witnesses remembered details differently months later than they had immediately after the incident. The prosecution acknowledged those differences while arguing that the central facts remained remarkably consistent. Kelly was repeatedly subjected to force. He suffered devastating injuries. He died 5 days later. Another emotionally difficult moment came when jurors heard Kelly's cries during the struggle. His repeated apologies. His pleas. His calls for his father. The courtroom grew noticeably quieter. Even in a legal setting focused on evidence rather than emotion, those words carried extraordinary emotional power. The prosecution argued they reflected fear. The defense argued they did not eliminate the officer's need to control someone actively resisting. Again, the same evidence supported opposing narratives. As closing arguments approached, both sides understood the challenge before them. The prosecution reminded jurors that police authority carries extraordinary responsibility. Officers are empowered to use force precisely because society expects them to exercise restraint. They argued that Kelly Thomas lost not only his life but also the protection every citizen deserves under the law. The defense urged jurors to resist judging officers through hindsight. Police encounters, they argued, unfold unpredictably. The law requires jurors to evaluate what officers reasonably believed during the incident, not what later became apparent after reviewing videos and medical reports. Finally, the attorneys finished speaking. The evidence had been presented. The witnesses had testified. The exhibits had been admitted. Nothing more remained to be argued. The case now belonged to the jury. Jurors withdrew to deliberate. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited. Families waited. Supporters of Kelly Thomas waited. Supporters of the former officers waited. No one knew how long deliberations would last. Every hour seemed endless. For Kelly's family, those hours represented years of grief condensed into one final period of uncertainty. For Ramos and Cicinelli, every passing moment carried the possibility of imprisonment. When the jury finally returned, the courtroom filled with anticipation. Everyone stood. The clerk prepared to read the verdicts. Silence settled across the room. The verdict on Manuel Ramos. Not guilty. The verdict on J. Cicinelli. Not guilty. The prosecution had failed to convince the jury beyond a reasonable doubt that the criminal charges had been proven. Legally, the case was over. Emotionally, it was only beginning again. Members of Kelly's family reacted with visible heartbreak. Supporters outside the courthouse expressed anger and disappointment. Many believed the verdict represented another example of the extraordinary difficulty involved in criminally prosecuting police officers. Others viewed the acquittals as confirmation that the evidence had not met the demanding standard required for conviction. Within hours, demonstrations resumed. The public debate intensified once more. Following the acquittals, prosecutors announced that they would not proceed with the remaining criminal case against Joseph Wolf. The reasoning was practical. If jurors had rejected the prosecution's theory against Ramos and Cicinelli, obtaining a conviction against Wolf appeared highly unlikely. The criminal proceedings had ended. No officer would serve prison time. Yet despite the acquittals, another reality remained unchanged. Kelly Thomas was still dead. His family still grieved. The city of Fullerton still carried the scars left by one July night. And although the courtroom had answered the legal question of criminal guilt, it had not answered the moral, professional, or societal questions that continued echoing far beyond the courthouse doors. Those questions would shape the next chapter of the story. Because sometimes a verdict ends a trial. It does not end the conversation the courtroom had emptied. The television cameras were packed away. The judge had left the bench. The jury had returned to their ordinary lives. Legally, the criminal case against Manuel Ramos and Jay Cicinelli was over. The verdict had been delivered. Both men had been acquitted. Under American law, they could not be tried again for the same criminal charges. For the justice system, the case had reached its conclusion. For everyone else, it felt like the beginning of another chapter. Outside the courthouse, emotions erupted almost immediately. Some people stood in stunned silence. Others cried openly. Many shouted in frustration. The disappointment among Kelly Thomas's supporters was impossible to miss. For years, they had believed the evidence would lead to criminal convictions. They had watched the surveillance footage. They had listened to the recordings. They had heard Kelly calling for his father. They had seen photographs documenting his injuries. To many, the acquittals felt impossible to reconcile with those images. Within hours, protesters gathered once again. Candles appeared. Handwritten signs returned. Kelly's name echoed through the streets of Fullerton. The demonstrations remained largely peaceful, but the emotions behind them were profound. Many protesters argued that if this case could not produce criminal convictions, then the legal standard for prosecuting police officers had become nearly impossible to satisfy. Others questioned whether any jury could realistically convict officers acting in the course of their duties, regardless of the evidence. Those questions extended far beyond Fullerton. Across the United States, commentators debated the outcome. Civil rights organizations criticized the verdict. Police organizations defended the importance of requiring proof beyond a reasonable doubt before convicting officers. Legal experts explained the distinction between moral responsibility and criminal liability. Many Americans found that distinction difficult to accept. The law asks jurors a narrow question. Has the prosecution eliminated reasonable doubt? It does not ask whether every decision made was wise. It does not ask whether the encounter could have been handled differently. It does not ask whether the outcome was tragic. Those questions belong to history. The courtroom answers only legal ones. For Kelly's family, however, legal explanations offered little comfort. Ron Thomas spoke publicly after the verdict. His grief remained visible. Years had passed since his son's death, yet the pain had not softened. He had sat through testimony describing Kelly's final moments. He had listened to recordings no father should ever hear. He had hoped that the trial would provide accountability. Instead, he walked away without the verdict he had expected. Yet even after the acquittals, Ron continued speaking about Kelly not as a symbol but as a son. He wanted people to remember the person behind the case. The young man before schizophrenia. The child before homelessness. The human being before national headlines. That distinction mattered deeply to him. Because somewhere along the way, public debate had transformed Kelly into an issue. Mental illness. Police reform. Use of force. Accountability. All important subjects. But beneath every argument stood a single life that could never be restored. The officers also faced a future dramatically different from the one they had known before July 2011. Although acquitted criminally, they did not return to policing. Manuel Ramos had already been dismissed from the Fullerton Police Department. Jay Cicinelli had been dismissed as well. Joseph Wolfe was no longer employed by the department. Each challenged those decisions through administrative appeals and subsequent litigation. They argued that the department's actions were unjustified. The legal battles continued for years. Ultimately, the terminations remained in place. The acquittals protected them from criminal punishment. They did not restore their careers. For police departments across California, the Kelly Thomas case became required reading. Administrators studied the incident carefully. Training officers discussed it during academy instruction. Questions about interacting with individuals experiencing mental illness received renewed attention. Departments increasingly expanded crisis intervention team training, encouraging officers to recognize behavioral health emergencies and employ de-escalation strategies whenever safely possible. The changes did not occur overnight. Nor were they solely the result of Kelly's case. But his death became one of several highly publicized incidents contributing to broader conversations about reform. Mental health professionals also entered the discussion. Many argued that police officers were too often placed in situations better suited for clinicians. Law enforcement officers responded because someone had called 911. But was law enforcement always the best response? Could trained crisis specialists have handled situations involving severe psychiatric illness differently? Those debates gained momentum during the years that followed. Some cities eventually experimented with co-response teams pairing officers with mental health professionals. Others developed alternative crisis response programs. No single solution emerged. But Kelly's story continued appearing whenever those policies were discussed. Meanwhile, Fullerton itself underwent significant change. 3 members of the city council lost their positions in a recall election driven largely by public dissatisfaction over the handling of Kelly's death. It was an extraordinary political consequence. Rarely does one incident reshape local government so dramatically. The recall reflected something deeper than disagreement over a single police encounter. It reflected a collapse of public trust. Many residents believed city leaders had failed to respond transparently during the early stages of the controversy. Rebuilding that trust would take years. Civil litigation continued even after the criminal proceedings concluded. Unlike criminal cases, civil lawsuits require a different legal standard. Instead of proof beyond a reasonable doubt, liability generally must be established by a preponderance of the evidence. Kelly's parents pursued civil claims against the city of Fullerton. Eventually, the city reached settlement agreements totaling approximately $5.9 million. The settlements did not constitute criminal findings of guilt. Nor did they erase the acquittals. They represented a separate legal resolution addressing civil claims arising from Kelly's death. Money, however, cannot restore a life. No financial settlement could return Kelly to his family. No amount could erase the memory of those final moments. No legal agreement could answer every question that remained. Years later, visitors occasionally stopped near the transportation center where Kelly had been confronted. For many commuters, it remained simply another station. People boarded trains. Children waited with parents. Workers hurried toward platforms. Life continued. History often leaves remarkably little physical evidence behind. There was no permanent reminder visible from every corner. No constant announcement that something extraordinary had happened there. Only those who knew the story understood the weight carried by that ordinary stretch of concrete. Kelly Thomas gradually became part of a much larger national narrative. When later incidents involving police use of force dominated headlines, journalists frequently mentioned his name alongside other cases that had shaped public discussion. Not because every case was identical. They were not. Each involved different facts, different officers, different communities, and different legal outcomes. Yet together they formed part of an ongoing conversation about policing, accountability, and public trust in America. Looking back, many observers reached different conclusions about the case. Some believed the criminal justice system functioned exactly as intended. Jurors carefully reviewed the evidence and found reasonable doubt. Others believed the legal standard for prosecuting officers remained so demanding that accountability became exceptionally difficult even in highly publicized cases. Reasonable people continue to disagree. The debate has never truly ended. Perhaps that is why Kelly Thomas's story still resonates. Not because it offers simple answers, but because it refuses to. It forces uncomfortable questions. How should society respond to severe mental illness? What level of force is acceptable when officers confront someone who is frightened, confused, and resisting? Can training reduce the likelihood of tragedies like this? How should communities balance officer safety with the protection of vulnerable individuals? Those questions remain as urgent today as they were in 2011. Kelly Thomas never chose to become part of that conversation. He never sought to become a symbol. He never imagined his name would appear in law schools, police academies, public policy discussions, documentaries, or newspaper editorials years after his death. He simply lived a difficult life shaped by an illness that changed everything. Then one summer evening, his path crossed with 6 police officers. The consequences extended far beyond that single night. Far beyond one courtroom. Far beyond Fullerton. His story became part of America's continuing effort to understand justice, compassion, policing, and accountability. And even though the verdict had been delivered, the deeper search for answers was only beginning.